10-Yard Fight was a game that seemed almost destined to reach American homes. Unlike most of the rest of the world, Japan is one of the few countries that acknowledges the abomination that is American football, a sport that took its name from a previously existing European sport while being a hybrid between soccer and rugby. This game was also only one of a few launch titles not to be developed by Nintendo. The Japanese company Irem developed both 10-Yard Fight and Kung Fu. Originally, both of these games were developed as arcade titles, but I'll get into Kung Fu's case later. Released in 1983 by the same name, the arcade version, rather than simulating all of football, only allowed for offense to be experienced by the player, while the computer would take up defense. For those who don't know, a team must reach 10 yards ahead of a tackle in order to reset the amount of downs, or outs, and to eventually score a touchdown. Thus, the title 10-Yard Fight, perfectly describing the activity of fighting the CPU to get 10 yards further, fit like a glove. The arcade game did quite well, topping charts in March of 1984. As such, when Nintendo had somewhat open access to game publishing for their home console, it was an obvious decision to port it to a new audience. 10-Yard Fight ended up making it to the Famicom in August of 1985, just a few months before the NES's launch in America. There was very likely a rush to localize it as quickly as possible. The game was a perfect fit for the new market, rounding out the other 4 sports titles quite well. The gameplay of the console version was adjusted quite a bit from its arcade counterpart. To start, both offense and defense were made playable. However, instead of moving down on the screen while on defense, the field would be flipped 180 degrees to keep directional controls consistent. On defense, the player can't actually control which members of the defense they get to move. This is entirely determined by the computer. On the other hand, the CPU gets to control all of their moves on offense, while you're relegated to dealing with the subpar AI determining what you're capable of doing. For a game that is just about as hands-off as baseball, relying heavily on computer decisions, you'd expect for them to be finely tuned. However, they aren't successful at all. The CPUs feel significantly harder than they should, and the gameplay is quite sluggish and frustrating. Graphically, the game is nothing special. There weren't many previous football titles, but all looked pretty abysmal. Real sports football on the Atari 2600 paled in comparison to 10-Yard Fight, but that's really not saying much. The sprites were certainly passable, at least by the standards of the time. The sounds were repetitive and annoying, a loop of the noise channel with a few beeps here and there after plays. By today's standards, the game has aged very poorly. As expected, 10-Yard Fight was hardly an inspirational game. It was never revisited by Nintendo, which notably lacks American football titles in their arsenal. Third parties did tackle the genre on the NES though. Tecmo Bowl was a notable title, starting in arcades and later transferring over to the NES in 1988 with a license from the NFL to use actual professional players in-game. The inclusion of real players would be a genre staple from this point onwards, lending a sort of personal appeal to the gameplay and allowing actual players to be controlled. It was also leagues better than Nintendo's 10-Yard Fight. It effectively rendered its precursor completely obsolete. Most modern players would choose Tecmo Bowl over 10-Yard Fight if they wanted to experience a football game on the NES. As was the case with other sports in early video game history, several other named football players tried to make the genre their own, including Joe Montana and Bill Walsh. However, the genre was ultimately taken over by Madden, with the first entry, John Madden Football, published by EA Sports, featuring a cross-system release on PC and console, coming out in 1988. Football actually wasn't a popular sport title for many years. Its higher tech requirements, due to the fast-paced action and multitude of players, would make sure of that. Nevertheless, come the 1990s, Madden and NCAA Football would each go on to release a title annually, working off of their own formulas completely separate from 10-Yard Fight. Overall, the NES launch title was nothing more than a footnote in the grand series of the genre. The game's main purpose, to provide Americans with a familiar title at the beginning of a foreign country's video game system at launch, was fulfilled. So in that way, it did everything it set out to do. Touchdown. No pun for this one, sorry.